Hello friends, welcome back to Aunt Debbie's Boutique. Today we're going to make a stained glass quilt, well, a quilt top. It will be quilted at a later date. What I am using is a layer cake with all these vivid colors, because when you think of stained glass, you think of really vivid colors. And then we're going to use our black to represent the lead bead that's between all the little pieces in a stained glass. Now, you can make as complicated or as simple a stained glass quilt as you want. I've made some gorgeous banners for church using this method, and they can get quite complicated. But for the sake of it coming out with a rectangular quilt and teaching beginners how to do stained glass quilts, we're going to keep it simple today. What I'm using, this layer cake, is by Artisan Boutiques, Prisma Dyes, and it's called Bright Rainbow. And there's 42 10-inch squares in this. Oh, it's by Robert Kaufman, I'm sorry. Artisan Boutiques is just the kind of fabric it is. But it's by Robert Kaufman, so it should be fairly easy to find. He's a real popular designer. Now, this is one of those layer cakes that has the pinked edges, the little zigzagged edges. And those drive me crazy because I never know if I should sew, if the 10 inches is from the top of the peak or the valley of the peak of those little edges, you know. So I measured this, and the peaks stood out further than 10 inches. So it was the valleys that were the 10-inch mark. So I took them and I trimmed off as much of that as I could. Some of them have just a little bit still on them, but I tried to straighten them and still keep them 10 inches just for the ease of sewing. And I know those that are left that still have that pinked edge or a piece of it, that is the 10-inch mark at the outside edge of it. I'm going to be using a 1/4-inch foot that has the little flange or the ledge so that your fabric, you can put it right up next to that and you'll have a perfectly straight seam. Now, sometimes I don't use that if it's a real complicated piecing project, because I find I need to use a scant 1/4 inch, and this is a full 1/4 inch. And so by using it, my blocks sometimes come out too small. But I tested it on this and it's going to work beautifully. Now, what I did was cut my layer cake into 3 pieces. This is a 6-inch piece. This was a 4-inch piece. Then I cut it halfway, which is 5 inches this way, 4 inches this way. Now you can see I made a few mistakes here on the edge when I tried to trim too many together, but I left it on there so I know to use that in my measurement when I'm sewing together. I'll just have to account for that in my seams. That's my faux pas. Then I cut out a bunch of 1-inch strips of black, and this is Kona cotton. This ravels pretty easily, and I don't know if all of them do it, but this black picks up every piece of fuzz. I don't know where it picks up some of this stuff, but I mean, dog hair, human hair, carpet fuzz, and I haven't had it on the carpet. I don't know, sweater fuzz, but it's like a magnet. So I have to keep one of those rollers handy to keep them, and especially it picks up threads. And you can see all these little knobbies that I cut off. I tried to clean this off, but some of them are sticking to it. So anyway, what we're going to do, I took 1-inch strips and then I cut these 4 inches long and these 10 inches long so that I could force my quilt to be a perfect, my block to be a perfect 10-inch square once we've put it back together. So what I'm going to do is take a 1/4 inch seam. Actually, I'm going to mix these colors up. I'm not going to use the same colors. But I'm going to sew these pieces first, then I'm going to sew it to a piece like this. So let's find, I want to use a pink. I want to use some bright colors so they're easy to see. How about this lime green? And how about this bright blue? And I'm going to make all my blocks exactly the same. And when we're done, I'm going to turn them different directions and put another black strip between all of them. And we're going to end up with a really beautiful quilt. So the first thing I want to do is take this to the machine and 1/4 inch stitch this black piece with right sides together. Then I will do the same on this side with right sides together. Then I'm going to bring it back and iron it and iron my seams open. And then I will sew this strip in. So let me take this over to the machine. I'm sewing with black thread. And because I cut these perfectly 4 inches and 10 inches, I want to make sure that these edges line up. If I end up getting off a little bit, sure, I can trim this one, but then we're going to be missing some here. And I don't want to trim this block down. If we do this right, they will still come out a perfect 10-inch square. So let's go do that. Now that we've sewn our little strip in the middle, we need to iron it. And I'm going to iron both sides away from the black. And the reason for that is if we ironed them to the black, they would get in the way of each other if your seam wasn't perfectly a 1/4 inch. So this is just makes them lay smoother. And by using, I need to tug that a little more. By using my 1/4 inch foot and getting a perfectly 1/4 inch seam, you'll see that this looks all equally spaced. Now for an even tighter look, you could cut 3/4 inch strips and only have a 1/4 inch between the two. But it's real hard to get that perfectly straight. So that's more of an advanced quilter. Okay, now I'm going to take this with right sides together and see it should be perfectly the same size within a hair, because my cutting is within a hair. I'm going to stitch that down and then I'll stitch it to this. So let's go do that. I'm going to stitch from this side so I can make sure that I keep these black seams nice and flat when I go over them. And I probably should be using a leader on this. And I probably will when I chain a bunch of them. have finished all my blocks, and I've put the first row together. And if you'll notice, the very first block has the two 4x5" pieces on the right hand side. Then I have the two of them at the top, then the two on the left hand side, then the two at the bottom. And I repeat that pattern for two more, and then I'm going to come back to the beginning of this row and continue the pattern on. So in the end, there will be a distinct pattern. And I put another 10-inch strip, 10 inch by 1 inch, black strip between each of these. So in the end, when we have them all put together, you're not going to be able to tell where the blocks are. It's going to look like we pieced each little block like a puzzle piece, which we kind of did, but in a simpler way. Okay, I laid this at an angle because my table's not wide enough for all of it, but I'm going to lay out the rest of this quilt block, and then we'll sew some more rows together. Okay, I have it laid out, but I've had to overlap it to get it to fit on the table, but you can see it's pretty much a random pattern, but it will fall into some sort of a pattern as we put it together. So I'm going to put it together row by row, and you can watch it grow. Now that I have all 7 rows done with 6 blocks in each row, I'm going to go back and cut 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 strips that are 1 inch by 60 inches. Now you'll have to piece these unless you have enough yardage to cut them lengthwise, which I think I do, so I may not have to piece these. And then the only thing we'll lack is 2 strips down the side. So sit back and watch me put the rows together. I wanted to jump in here and show you one important step when sewing the rows together. You want to make sure your strip is exactly 60 inches when you sew it on to the first one. Then when you go to sew it onto the second one, we want to take the intersections of the blocks, and even though, let me get down here, I had to rip this one out because I forgot to pin it and it didn't come out right. Even though you're sewing a seam up to a piece of fabric, this little black strip that's not a seam, you want to make sure, and see this one's a little bit wider than that one, so that's the reason we want to make sure we match it up and pin it at all the intersections, and then force fit it. But what happened when I didn't sew it is I ended up with about 1 inch left over here on the end, and I thought something's not right. And it probably has to do with some of my little strips being slightly different in size, but they're not enough different that we can't compensate for them. So we want to make sure and line up the stripe. Just pin it there in the center. And see, now it comes out right. But in sewing it, somehow I had stretched the wrong side as I went. There's a little bit of slack there, so I'm going to have to kind of tug on it to work it in. That's the worst place on this. But we want to make sure that all of our intersections are lining up right, even though there's a black strip in between them. So if our corner's off a hair, it's not going to be noticeable, just as long as it's real close to lining up. So I wanted to show you that for putting together the rows. Now all our rows are put together, and the only thing still left to do is to put a 1-inch strip on each side, and then it'll be ready to quilt. So let's get that started. My quilt measures 71 inches at this point, so that's how long I'm going to make both strips. Here's our completed quilt. It's just a hair too wide to lay flat on my table, but it's basically 60 inches wide by 70 inches tall. And I think I said that I was making my strip 71. I remeasured it, it was 70. So make sure that you measure twice and cut once. And I may add a border at some point. I'm not sure. A border would make it nicer for when it was quilted. That gives you a little bit of forgiveness if the quilting's not perfectly straight. But I kind of like it without a border. Here is the fabric I'm going to put on the back of it. I thought it had all the same colors in it and is bright and colorful. So that's going to go on the back, and I will probably do my binding in just plain black. Now what I used for this quilt was 1 1/4 to 1.25 yards of black fabric, depending on how straight you can cut all the time. You can get it out of 1 1/4 if you don't ever have to stop and trim up your seams again, because I think it's like you need 43 strips, 1-inch strips. So if you can cut 43 1-inch strips without having to straighten and trim a little off and straighten it ever so often, you can get it out of 1 1/4, but I would go for 1 1/2 to be on the safe side. And that, so 1 1/2 yards of black fabric plus 1 layer cake. And you can use any fabrics you want. I just wanted these bright batiks because they looked more like a stained glass. I needed, let's see, 72 10-inch strips, 42 4-inch strips, 8 60-inch strips, and 2 70-inch strips. And the yardage, the way I quoted it, is for always cutting it from selvage to fold, the width-wise, and you have to piece the 60 and 70-inch strips. I had to piece the 70-inch ones, but I had enough fabric. I had more than what I needed, so I didn't have to piece the 60-inch strips. Of course, the whole key to this is keeping your black strips equal width. Mine aren't perfect. I can see places where they don't line up just as perfectly as I'd like for them to, but the only person that's going to notice that is me, and maybe one of those quilters that's a perfectionist, one of those really good quilters. But once it's quilted and it's flopped over a couch or whatever, nobody's ever going to notice if they're not perfectly straight. And mine are real close to being perfectly straight, so I'm pleased with it. This was a very simple quilt to make for a beginner, because for each block there's just two seams that you have to sew. Well, I guess there's technically 4, because each side of the black strip. But what makes the distinct pattern and makes it look more like a stained glass is turning the blocks different ways. And you could put yours all the same ways. You could just choose 2 different ways and go back and forth. There's all sorts of patterns you can make with this. So it's a fun quilt to make, and it's an easy quilt to make. So I encourage a beginner to try this. Our next quilt that I think we're going to do is going to be a simple, basic log cabin quilt. Those are fun too, and there's so many different ways you can put the blocks together to get different effects that it makes it like 20 quilts in one. You can make the same blocks over and over again and come up with totally different quilts. Please let me know if you like this format. Will I make one quilt in one and put it in all in the same video, or if you would rather I had more videos and a little more detail to show a little more what I was doing. I'm just trying to make it the most accommodating for those of you who are trying to learn. And while I'm working on the log cabin quilt, we will continue on with our pot holders. I've got a whole slew of new pot holders that are all different fruits that we're going to be working with. So, thank you for joining me. I hope you enjoyed this. Please give it a thumbs up if you did. And I hope to see you next time. Remember, whatever you do, do it to the glory of the Lord.